My name is Ryan Young, and I'm the coordinator for the Technical Assistance and Research Center here at the National Council of Urban Indian Health. And again, thank you for joining us today for this webinar, Customer Service, Hiring and Supervising Frontline Staff. If you haven't already done so, please provide your name and organization in that chat box. There we go. All lines are currently muted, but if you wish to ask a question, we ask that you write them in the Q&A box, and that's in the lower right-hand side of your screen. And we're going to provide time for your questions to be answered at the end of the presentation. The Executive Community of Learning is tailored towards those in leadership positions and those that hire and manage frontline staff. And we hope by providing you with this relevant information and practical tips that we can support you in being successful in your staffing and managing activities. Today's presenter is Tony Scucci, and Tony's a licensed social worker and a certified governance trainer. Over the past 10 years, Tony has provided governance and management effectiveness training sessions for over 30 urban Indian health organizations and for the National Council of Urban Indian Health. He's also worked with urban Indian health organizations in managing executive leadership transitions, facilitating strategic planning sessions, and providing executive coaching. So I'm going to pass things over to Tony now. Thank you, Tony, for leading this training today.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to Alessandra and Kimberly, the whole team there at NCUI. I appreciate your introduction, and I appreciate all your support in setting up this webinar. And welcome and good morning or good afternoon, whatever it may be, to all of you all who are joining us today. We're going to look at a goal for this webinar here, and really it's to look at some strategies in recruiting, hiring, and supervising staff, particularly staff who have direct connections with clients. And I've used the term frontline staff. I've heard many urban program staff people use that term as well. And I'm defining that as folks who really very often are the first point of contact where a patient walks in the door or a patient picks up the phone and the person who answers at the other end is their first contact with your organization. So that's what I'm talking about when I use the term direct, frontline staff. So this is a goal for where we're going today. And what I'd like you to do is to ponder a couple of questions. And we're going to come back to these questions, but I'd like you to think about these two questions. And if you have any thoughts or comments, please put them into the chat box, and we'll come back and look at those later on in the webinar. But the first question really has to do with, what do we mean when we're talking about outstanding customer service? What would it actually look like? So not so much an abstract definition, but what would we be able to observe around really good customer service? And the second question that occurred to me as I prepared for the webinar is this question about patients being like customers, but in some ways your patients are not at all like customers. So I thought it'd be good to think about, how are your patients not like customers? What sets them apart from what you would think about as a kind of conventional customer? So if you would, please ponder those questions and make some notes to yourself, your thoughts about that. Put them in the chat box if you'd like to, and we'll come back to revisit these questions a little bit and see what your thoughts are about that. Here's our agenda for today. I'm going to do an overview, basically, of the unique nature of the frontline position. There's certain qualities about a frontline staff person that are really critical. So we'll look at that. We'll look at the core competencies, and we'll also spend time throughout this whole webinar differentiating between skills and personal qualities. And as we go on, I'll explain how I define those somewhat differently from each other. And I think it's helpful to think about them as two different things. So we'll look at that as an overview. We'll then look at hiring practices, capability, capacity, and cultural fit. We'll look at some interviewing techniques, some things that I've learned along the way working with many, many organizations that I think you might find helpful. And then we'll move from the hiring practices to actually the supervisory practices. The performance review as a context for having good accountabilities, but also for providing support and professional development for your staff. And then the notion of the relationship, and how do we attend to the relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee, in particular when the supervisee is somebody who has direct client contact. And then there'll be an evaluation at the end of the session. I think what will happen is Ryan will post a link shortly after we get done. And if you go to that and complete that evaluation form, that would be very much appreciated. NCUE takes evaluation very seriously. We'll look at your comments and your feedback. We'd also would welcome any ideas you have for future topics for webinars. That's the time to put them in. So please do that and know that, that we are paying attention and listening. So as I consider this whole thing, I think about why is this frontline person so critical? And when I think about that, it reminds me, I guess the parallels for me are when I think about when I go to the bank, for example. In my mind, the most important person who works in the bank is the teller. This is the person I come in contact with first and often. This is somebody who is, in a sense, kind of an ambassador for the entire bank. So when you think about your health center, similarly, the person that picks up the phone or the person who welcomes the patient coming in the door, this is an ambassador for your organization. And to a large extent, your agency is going to be judged on the way this person responds to and treats patients. So it's really important. It's not by accident, for example, that if you walk into a Walmart, there are people who are designated welcomers. That's not by accident. That's intentional. That's to make people feel welcome. And it can be done in a very genuine way, or it can be done in a very artificial way. And I think we all know that if it's not done in a genuine way, patients will know that right away. Another example around this frontline person being so critical, I think is a parallel. I've never stayed in a Ritz-Carlton hotel, but what I understand is that it is a policy that if any guest of the hotel asks any employee for directions somewhere, like to the swimming pool or to the gift shop, that the employee, no matter who they are, will stop what they're doing and escort that guest to where they want to go, rather than give directions. And I think that's another good example of what we strive to do in health centers, is to really anticipate what the patients may need and what they're looking for and their expectations, and make sure we not only meet their needs, but we actually exceed their expectations around service. So when we look at hiring people for these particular positions, we really want to look at core competencies, and core competencies have to do with knowledge around your mission, knowledge of your agency itself. You want to have somebody who can answer questions intelligently about your organization, perhaps a little bit of its history, and just general kind of knowledge. It's important for people who work with direct staff, who work with clients and patients, that they have an understanding of what's going on in the world, what's going on in their community. Another area of competencies has to do with skills. And here again, I look at technical skills and transferable skills, and I differentiate. Technical skills, for example, a technical skill would be keyboarding skills. A transferable skill is a skill that can be transferred to many other settings. For example, if you have an employee who is multilingual or bilingual, that's a transferable skill. If you can speak English and you can speak Spanish, that's a transferable skill. It's very helpful not only in a health center, but in many other places. And then experience. What have you done? What did you learn from what you've done? So these are the kind of core competencies that you want to get to as you do your interviews for candidates for these positions. There are also competencies that have to do with self-concept, how the person sees themselves, their degree of self-awareness, how well they manage themselves. Motivation, why this job? It's really important in your interviewing candidates or screening candidates to have a sense of what their real motivation is. And then personal traits, whether a person is introverted or extroverted, whether they tend to be self-directed, their worldview, for example. I mean, can you imagine a frontline worker who sees the world as a glass that's always half empty instead of half full? that's the kind of thing that you look for when you're doing the interviews. Cultural competence is another area you look for that's in here, and that has to do with transferable skills. That has to do with understanding oneself in the larger world, and in communicating across different cultures. So what I do is I put a diagram up here to share with you how when you're interviewing people, and so that you all know this is an iceberg, because I say it's an iceberg. I am not very good at drawing things in a PowerPoint, but this is an iceberg. This is the waterline. And if you're looking at core competencies of an iceberg, you would know that the knowledge and the skills and the experience a person has is really just the tip of the iceberg. You could determine that very quickly and very easily, looking at applications and a very quick interview. But the issues that you want to get to are the things that are below the surface. Those questions around self-concept, motivation, personal traits. And that's what we will do in this webinar, is to spend some time in the hiring and in the screening portion of the webinar looking at some ways in which you get at this whole thing of trying to get a sense of who is this person in front of me. When I think about performance in employees, and I think about some of the reasons for why performance is poor, often it has to do with the person simply just not having their heart in the job. They don't really feel a sense of purpose. It's why it's important that when you hire people, you hire them not only to a position, but you hire them to the mission. They are part of your team to advance good health care for your patients and your community. Poor performance very often has to do with jobs where typically not about skills and not about knowledge. Really has to do with whether the person is motivated and intelligent enough. If the person is motivated and intelligent, they can pretty much learn any skills. Poor performance also has something to do with being unclear about what my job is. So having a poorly written job description is another explanation for poor performance. Having said this, let me just say as another kind of anecdote, I go to a bagel shop near my home, and when I go into the bagel shop sometimes, I get a bagel and my coffee, and I hand the young man behind the counter my credit card, and he swipes it, and he hands it back to me, and he says to me, "Thank you, Tony." He doesn't just say thank you. He says, "Thank you, Tony." And what that means, I know, is that he's looked at my credit card and looked at my name. But the message there is that I am a person. I'm not simply a transaction. That's an example of something that I would call a personal quality. It's something you can't really teach people. It's something that they have or they don't have. Personal qualities are things that people have or they don't have. Another great anecdote I'll share with you, and if you've ever been in an airplane, you'll appreciate this. I was on a flight once on a small airplane. There was one flight attendant, and I was on a flight that was pretty full, and most everybody on this flight all appeared to be people that travel a lot. And so we've all heard the safety instructions before, and you probably can imagine when the person up front puts on that recording, everybody's still reading their newspaper or doing their notes or looking at their computers, and no one's really paying attention. I had a flight attendant once who, before she started that recording, she got our attention. And she said, "I want everyone to listen to me." And she said it in such a way that everybody picked up their heads. And then she went on to say, "I'm going to give you the best safety instructions you've ever had on a flight." And now she's really got everyone's attention. And as I'm observing this, everybody now is paying attention to her. She starts the recording, and as it goes through those various safety measures about if we fly over water and there's an emergency landing, there's a life raft under the seat, and she dramatically, in very physical ways, dramatized the entire recording. It was so impressive. Everybody paid attention, and when all was said and done, she got a round of applause. And I think that flight attendant, whoever hired that person, I don't know if they knew she had those qualities, but she was somebody who had personal qualities that made that job very different from, and made my experience very different from any experience I've ever had on an airplane. That's the kind of person I want to hire if I'm hiring a flight attendant. Somebody who has those kind of personal, natural qualities. So that's an anecdote just to share with you that stays with me to this day, and that was a long time ago. So when you think about personal qualities, What are some examples? What are some specific examples that I'm talking about when I talk about personal quality? I'm talking about honesty, integrity. And we know you can't teach people integrity. People have integrity or they don't. Empathy, critically important for anyone who works directly with patients. People who come to your clinic and are sometimes nervous or anxious or vulnerable. Being able to reach out and understand what it's like to be in their shoes. Having a strong work ethic, that's an example of a personal quality. I know I have a very strong work ethic, and I got it from my parents growing up. By the time I went out looking for a job in the workplace, I had it. If I didn't have it, I'm not going to get it by that point. Being a team player, it's really important, especially in the urban programs, to make sure that everybody in their different jobs are working together as a team. Not everybody is a team player. Having a sense of humor. What a tremendous quality to have in the person who answers the phone at your office. What a tremendous quality, a sense of humor. A worldview, as I said earlier, somebody who sees the glass full rather than the glass empty. Those are kind of examples. Oh, and respect for clients. And respect for clients, when I ask people about client service, customer service, I always say you have to respect the clients. And respect is one of those things where it's very important, but I want to know what does that look like. So show me some behaviors that are reflective of respect for clients. But these are personal qualities. These are things, if we go back to the iceberg, these are the things that are under the surface. They're not at the tip of the iceberg. Interpersonal skills. It's key for anybody in the helping professions to have really highly refined interpersonal skills. The ability to engage others. And others, I was almost going to put others in quotes because engaging people who are like you, who are similar to you, who speak your language, who are from your culture, that's one thing. Reaching out to people from different cultures who speak different languages, from different communities, however you define that, being able to engage others is an essential skill that you have to have if you're going to be an effective in a helping profession. Ability to learn from past successes and failures. If a person can't learn from their mistakes and from their successes, they're not going to develop and improve professionally. Somebody has to have the ability to do that, and it's something that you can't really teach somebody. You either have it or you don't. Cultural competence. Again, I talked about this, and this runs through everything. Being as grounded as you can be in the culture of the people that you're serving. The ability to communicate across cultures. This is something that's really important as well, and we have to always be mindful of our communication. If you think about language as an example, language is so imprecise, and yet it's the way we mostly communicate. And language, if you're not aware and you're communicating across cultures, language can be very confusing. I share with you an anecdote. If you are from a basketball culture and you are communicating with somebody from a soccer culture, very quickly you realize that the rules are different. So in the basketball culture, you can use your hands. You cannot use your feet. In the soccer culture, it's just the opposite. You use your hands. You can't use your feet. And if you're communicating from basketball culture to soccer culture, you have to understand those differences. It's part of a cultural competence, and it's part of the capacity to communicate across cultures. The ability to accept constructive criticism. Again, if you're going to improve, you've got to hear from others how well you're doing and where you can improve. So there's three basic steps when you go into hiring, folks. And let me remind folks at this point in the webinar, if you do have some questions, please feel to ask anytime. Put them in the chat box. Ryan will be looking at them, and he'll be sorting them and summarizing them in some way. And we will address all your questions to the extent we can at the very end of the webinar. So we turn back now to basic hiring practices. And there are three steps here. First one is you've got to have a position description. This is pretty obvious. And it has to outline the tasks, the duties, and the responsibilities. So it's important that the job description is accurate. It accurately reflects the expectations, the duties, the responsibilities of the job. Clarifying the necessary knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job successfully. And that's very important. Qualities and qualifications. And again, a distinction between the two. A quality might be that somebody is very personable. A qualification might simply be that you need a bachelor's degree to do this job successfully. So differentiating there is important. And thirdly, nailing down performance expectations. So that really has to do with this performance review. So it's about making sure you have a good tool and a good process in place for performance reviews. This is the mechanism where you hold the employee accountable, but it's also the mechanism for providing that employee with guidance and support, and for support in developing professionally. 3 basic areas as you consider this. There's capability. So what skill sets does this person have, and what is their experience? And experience could be directly working, for example, in a healthcare center. It could be experience in the retail sector, where the customer service is a very important part of the work. Experience that really reflects whether the person is capable of doing the job. Then there's a question of capacity. Is the person able to learn new things, and is the person able to grow in the job? And that's a very different kind of thing. And then thirdly, cultural fit, mission and values. And it's really important to reiterate here that when you hire people, you hire them not only to the position, but you hire them to the mission. When I think of an example of that, I would think about a receptionist in your clinic, and if I ask your receptionist what you do here, I would like her or him to respond by saying, I'm part of the team that provides really outstanding health care for our patients, rather than I answer the phone. You want people to see themselves in the mission and to be part of it, and to be part of it in their everyday practice and in their interactions with patients. Some thoughts on interviewing. So as you get to the point now where you're actually interviewing candidates, what I'll do is to share with you some things that I've learned over a lot of time, paying attention and talking to folks, and actually experiencing some of this myself. When you're doing interviews, one of the things I encourage everyone to do is to suspend drawing conclusions. When you begin the interview process, it's simply to get information. You are in the process of taking in information about a person, getting a sense of who this person is in front of you. It's not about making conclusions about things, simply taking in information. If somebody comes in for an interview and they are overly dressed or underly dressed in the sense of what you think is appropriate, don't draw a conclusion about that. Simply take it in as information. When you ask questions, look for responses. Don't look for necessarily answers that are right or wrong. Look for the way the person is thinking. Emphasizing concrete versus abstract. If you don't have a lot of experience in interviewing, there's a tendency to talk in the abstract. You really want to get to concrete stuff, concrete examples. Examples of interview questions is something I'll show you on the next slide. Where are some examples that I think would be helpful, I've seen as very helpful tools in trying to go through a vetting process to select the best candidates. Scenario questions are really important and are very effective. But you need to be clear about what you want to find out in the scenario questions. And those are the kind of what-if questions. And if you don't, when you're interviewing folks and you're preparing for an interview, when you think about what would be good scenario questions, simply think about some experience in the past when things have happened in your waiting room, for example, where would make for good scenarios. Something went wrong. Perhaps the power went out, or perhaps there was some altercation, or a patient came in and they were obviously intoxicated. You could take a real example and create a scenario question around that, and it's a good way to get at the way a person that you're interviewing would be thinking and responding to those situations. Testing for specific skills, the skills that are connected to the job. If this job requires telephone skills, well, part of your interview process ought to be on a telephone. It's as simple as that, testing for specific skills. And what I call, finally, the rule of 4. And you'll see as I share with you some of these open-ended interview questions on the next slide, the rule of 4 is simply this. Excuse me. When you ask an open-ended interview question, you want to be prepared to follow it up with at least 4 follow-up questions. And the challenge here is that you don't know what your follow-up questions will be until you hear the responses. So you have to be prepared for that. It's why it's a good idea to interview with a panel of people rather than just one-on-one. And so the rule of 4 is simply that. You ask an open-ended question, the candidate responds, you ask a follow-up to that response, they respond to that, you ask a follow-up to that response, they respond to that, and so on. If you can do this, it's one of the most effective techniques for getting at who this person really is in front of me. All that stuff in terms of the iceberg that would be below the surface. So here are some samples of interview questions. And again, I've gleaned these from work that I've done with various organizations over a lot of time. So let me share one with you here. This is kind of a good opening question. Tell us something about your experience and background and how it prepares you for this position. That's a great question, and it's an improvement over what might typically be a more general open-ended question. The question, for example, why do you want this job? This question is not asking why you want this job. It's really about how do you see yourself in this position? And there's a distinction there. So this is a really good kind of opening question for an interview. A second question. What do you see as the most important qualities of a frontline worker? This really gets at how this person sees themselves and sees those qualities. Tell us about an error in judgment that you made in your life and what were the results. This is the kind of question that helps you get at, can this person learn from their mistakes? It also is a question that gets at honesty. How direct and honest is this person? What do they say? How do they respond to this question? And again, this is one of those questions that will lead to multiple follow-up questions for sure, because you really want to get at what were the results, what did they learn, how did it improve their performance going forward, and whether because people make mistakes in their jobs. What you don't want to do is have people make the same mistakes over and over. Making mistakes is not necessarily a bad thing. Often it's a good thing. Making the same mistakes over and over is not a good thing. Are there some skills or personal qualities that you possess that we may not have asked you about? This is a really good question too, because it gives a candidate a chance to kind of talk about themselves. And then another and final question here, what would you like to ask us? In my experience, good candidates always come with questions. So if the person doesn't have any questions, I would register that somewhere. I wouldn't draw any conclusions from it, but I would register as I'm taking in information and suspending my conclusions. I would really look to the questions people ask and the kind of questions they ask, because those questions are revealing. They'll give you an idea of who the person is. And we come back now to the questions I asked you to ponder earlier. And so I would invite your thoughts here if you've put something in the chat box, or if you would do it now. What does outstanding customer service look like to you? Do we have some responses to that, Ryan? I can't hear Ryan.
Feel free to type in a response in that chat box, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, please feel free to do that. And in fact, I can proceed if you have, and you can continue typing in questions if you have them or comments. Please feel free to do that. And I will, seeing that there aren't any at this point, I'm going to move on. Some thoughts about hiring. Number one, as I said, hire to the mission, not just the position. So that's a basic. And that has to come across in your conversations, in your interviews as well. Personal values and organizational values have to be aligned. You have to hire, you can only hire people, and people can only be successful in your place of employment if their values and your values are aligned. And that really has to do with how we treat our patients and our clients. If people have attitudes about, some people have an attitude about folks who are living on the margins, for example. Well, if that value contradicts your values as an organization, they're not going to work out for you. A tool or a process for conducting a performance review in place when you hire the person. This is something that I don't see as often as I wish I did. I think it's essential, and if you don't have it in place, I would really encourage you to do that. If you're in the process of hiring somebody to a position right now is the time to make sure you have the tool and the process in place so you can answer their question on what will I be evaluated. Having that in place at the beginning makes very good sense. And then finally, references. References are really important, and they are very revealing. And I will share with you when I talk about this, and people say, well, I call the references, and they always say to me, I can only tell you the dates the person was employed and what their job was. That may be technically true, but there are ways in which to have conversations with people who are references to get a feel for the kind of person in the job, and you really have to do your best to try to get at that. References are very, very important. So I move on now to what you're looking for ultimately. Technical skills. They may be skills like keyboarding or coding in the case of healthcare. Technical skills are really just kind of what you'd imagine. They're technical. There are the transferable skills, the ability to improvise, the ability to sell things. Very often this is a skill. You may have a patient that comes into your clinic and they need particular service, and you feel confident that they need this service, but they're not quite sure. You want to be able to help them understand that service the way a good salesperson would so they can make an informed decision about that. And that's not to say you're going to sell them a used car they don't want. It's that make sure that you give them good information so that they can make an informed decision. Now that's a sales skill as much as anything else. Personal qualities, again, I come back to that. Does the person have a sense of humor? Are they able to empathize with others? These are really important. They're essential for anybody who works directly with folks. You can teach someone how to answer the phone, but you can't teach them to be pleasant. They're either pleasant or they're not. And so these are things you absolutely, with real intention, want to get at when you're going through your process of screening prospective employees, in particular those that work with patients and clients. I want to share with you now a story about People Express. And for those of you who are not old enough to remember, People Express was an airline company that started up in the early 1980s. And I want to use this example because I think there are real parallels around this notion of customer service. People Express started as a new company in the early 1980s. The CEO had an idea that he wasn't going to try and get a portion of the market share of flyers. He was going to create a new market. And in order to create a new market, he had to know who were my prospective customers. So he began a company that was called People Express, and paramount was customer service. And for that company, it meant knowing what your customers want. And what the customers wanted, people who had never flown before, what they really wanted was to get to where they're going with no frills and no added expenses. They wanted to get there from point A to point B, and that was it. The company was truly people-oriented. Their culture, the culture he created was a culture that's oriented towards people. If you recall, even on the airplane, the logo was the tail fin, and it was a profile of a person's face. Everything about this company, including the name and the logo, was focused around people, people-oriented. Interpersonal skills were emphasized in the recruitment and hiring and training. It would not be uncommon, and I've done this in those days, to ask a flight attendant what they did before they became flight attendants. And it would not be uncommon for them to say, I was a social worker. I worked in the helping professions. I worked in retail. The people who come with interpersonal skills. And so the company realized in a very smart way that they needed that. These are essential skills if we're going to be successful in this company. Transferable skills and personal qualities. Cross-training. If you worked for People Express during those days, in almost every position, you would find that after 6 months on the job, you would be rotated out of your position and into a totally different one. People in the industry thought that was crazy, but long-term, it made very good sense because after a while, everybody could do everybody else's job. So whenever there was delays or people were out sick, folks could step in for each other. Cross-training was really central to them being successful in delivering services to their customers and in a way that made them exceptional to all other airlines at the time. The compensation structure was inverted. They paid their pilots less than any other airline by a large margin, and they had people waiting to work for them, flying planes. In terms of other positions as well, they realized that the flight attendants and the person who you buy your ticket from and the person that checks your bag, these are your frontline people. They were compensated much higher than you would normally expect. Because the company realized how important those people were, not only to satisfying customers, but having customers come back. Every employee in People Express was a manager, and in fact, if you worked for them, you had to buy stock in the company. The idea was to make you feel part of the company. It's the idea of being part of the mission. And in fact, it was People Express that changed, prior to them coming into being, flight attendants were called stewards or stewardesses. They changed it to not only flight attendants, but they were literally called flight managers. And if you looked at their name tag, it would have their name and it would say flight manager or customer service manager. Everybody was a manager. Everybody was given responsibility. Every employee was an owner. In fact, everybody was an owner and felt like they were owners. And this is a way that even the most entry-level position would be, you would be an ambassador for the entire company. And the entire company was judged based on the service that every customer had with every contact, starting right from the check-in to the baggage handler to the flight attendants. And then finally, their structure was as flat as they could make it. The CEO made himself available, accessible to employees. And when he did that at the time, there was a concern that everybody be beating down his door. He couldn't manage it, but it never happened. When people got to the point that they came to him, it typically was something that was very important, and he wanted it to come to him. So that is kind of a story about what I think is a company or an organization that took customer service in a very special and personal way and operationalized it, made it happen. It's a fascinating study, and I recall, I read a study of this, which is where my information comes from. So I thought that might be of value to you all as you compare your organization with some of these things and some of these programs that they put in place, like cross-training, for example, and emphasizing personal skills, and communicating a message that we are about people here. We are not about handing out medicine. We are here to serve people in all their complexities and all their needs. So we move now from kind of screening and interviewing and selecting to actually doing supervision of employees, in particular direct line employees. So we'll look at some supervisory practices that I have observed that I think are really good practices. Meeting regularly and keeping notes. So this is about the supervisor-supervisee relationship. It's very important that you meet regularly with your staff, if you're a supervisor, and that you keep notes. Keeping notes is a good way to make sure that you're communicating effectively and that there's a mutual understanding of what you talk about, what you discuss. Creating time and space. You send a very clear message to an employee when you say it's time to meet for supervision. It's so important that I'm not taking any phone calls for the next half hour. I'm not taking any messages. I'm putting my cell phone down. This is your time, and I'm going to focus on you. It communicates a message of respect and regard for your employee. Performance goals are used as a framework for this discussion. So as I said earlier, if you have good performance review process in place, the outcome of that, or one of the outcomes, are performance goals for the year going forward. And these might be 5 or 6 very important goals that are specific and measurable, things that you want to track with this employee that are important for them to either make corrective actions or to improve professionally. So you create that as your framework, and every time you meet, that becomes, in a sense, your agenda. Delegating responsibilities versus tasks. When you delegate responsibilities for people, they rise to the occasion almost always, and they feel highly valued and regarded. Being told what to do does not typically engender feeling valued. So think about, as you delegate, to try and delegate in terms of responsibilities, which really has to do with, here's the outcome I want you to get to, versus this is the thing I want you to do. Developmental issues. And I put this in here because it's a lesson that I learned a long time ago when I was a CEO, and I had 6 people reporting to me. And one of the folks that reported to me, she and I had incredible difficulties communicating. And I had a very hard time, and I was working with a coach at the time. And as I was describing this employee's behavior, the coach said to me, you know what, you're describing an adolescent. And it dawned on me that in some ways, this employee, with all due respect, was in some ways in a developmental stage that was somewhat adolescent. And what that means, and what that meant for me, is that I need to communicate with this person as if she were an adolescent. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. I mean it developmentally. So with her, I had to be much more direct. I had to be very concrete in what I was thinking I wanted her to do. And once I came to that realization and made the change in my practice, our relationship got much better, and she really grew into the job. So understanding where the person is developmentally is a really important aspect of good supervision. And nurturing feedback. One of the hardest things to get if you are supervising someone is honest feedback from the person you're supervising. And it's, you know, it's natural, it's understandable, because there's this power differential. This is the person who works for you. This is the person for whom their performance you will evaluate. It's difficult for them very often to give you honest feedback, but you work towards that. You nurture that. You invite your supervisee to give you feedback. Every now and again, you have to ask the question, how am I doing as a supervisor? What could I do to be more supportive? What could I do to be more effective in communicating what I need from you? Those are good questions, and you have to work at that. I was reminded not long ago by a person who was a retired military person that in the military, when you are talking to a supervisor, the person who's in charge of you, if you were to preface your comment by saying, sir, may I speak freely, in the military culture, that automatically means that your superior is going to know that you're going to say something they may not want to hear, and your superior is going to say, okay, tell me. It's part of the culture. Building something like that into your culture is really important, because getting feedback from the people who report to you directly is the best way to know how you're doing. So nurturing feedback is really important. Questions to consider, just kind of ponder as we go along here. How do you communicate to your frontline staff their importance? In what ways do you actually do that? How do you speak to them? When you do meet, do you meet and give them your undivided attention? Do you check in on how they're doing from time to time? I had a client once, and I remember one of the CEO in the company, there was one of his direct reports who said to me, you know, he's been here for 3 years and he doesn't know my kids' names. He is somebody who doesn't pay attention to me as a whole person. He only sees me in my role. Knowing who works for you, knowing what their lives are like, paying attention, caring about them as whole people, these are things that engender good performance and people feel valued. And how do I compensate these folks? If my frontline people are so critical, how do I justify the salaries, the benefits I'm offering them? If I want to attract the very best people at that front line, how do I set compensation? Good question to ask. because we have to kind of take our values and translate that into practices, and how much you compensate frontline people is a practice. If you really value them, then the compensation should reflect that. As I go on and think more about sources of feedback, I think about three things. You get feedback from your supervisor. You get feedback from coworkers, and you have opportunities, or if you don't already, to get feedback from your clients or your patients. Everyone that has an interest in you being successful in your job, any of those people are good sources of feedback. So when we think about folks who are frontline people, let's say the person who's a receptionist in your office, if you are not in some way getting feedback from clients and patients about that person's performance, you're missing an opportunity to get a real sense of how he or she is doing in terms of making them feel welcome, in terms of making sure that the patient is well informed, guided in making certain decisions, directed to the right staff person, and so on. So asking those kind of questions is really important. And as a kind of a caveat, I'm not simply saying you do a survey of your patients and you ask them for their, what they call a customer satisfaction. Customer satisfaction is an aspect of this, but it's not the whole thing. I would not be looking necessarily to know whether my patients are satisfied. I want to know whether they feel like they got good service. And that is somewhat different and somewhat the same, but I would definitely tease that out, and I would find a mechanism to have ongoing feedback loops between my patients and my center so that I can continue to be in touch with them. And from time to time, I would share the findings of that feedback with my patients in a newsletter, postings in the waiting room. When you ask somebody what they think and how they feel and how they experience something, and you respond, and they respond, and you get back to them, they feel valued. It's a way to demonstrate value and respect for your patients. Giving feedback. So you're in a situation where you have the employee, you have supervised them, and you're giving them feedback. So as a supervisor, you really want to be descriptive rather than evaluative when you give feedback. It's about describing the behavior you're talking about, not evaluating it. Being specific, using examples. One of the best ways to communicate is to use an example. So it would be, when I noticed you speaking to that patient, it seemed to me like you were not very patient. Pardon the confusion there. But it's a way to be specific. Examples are very helpful. Direct the conversation to the behavior to the receiver, the behavior that they can do something about. So asking somebody to do something they can't do is foolish. Expecting somebody to do something they're not able to do is foolish. So the behavior has to be about something that they can do something about. Timing, giving feedback when it's least threatening. If you're going to give an employee feedback and it's going to be critical, for sure you want to be doing that in a thoughtful way and probably one-on-one, because otherwise it's perceived as threatening or shaming or embarrassing. So the timing of it is really important. And sometimes the timing of it means right after you may have observed something. At other times it may be, no, we're going to reflect on this and come back to it when we meet for regular supervision. But it's very intentional about the timing of giving feedback. Summarizing at the end of the time you're talking to your employee, summarize to ensure that there's clear communication. So when you point out an issue that came up and you discuss it and you state what you expect, you want to make sure, that you say to the employee, so that I make my point clearly. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Are you clear with what I'm saying? If you're confused, this is the time to ask. And that's a good way to kind of get honest feedback. Feedback is very important because if you're getting good feedback and you're open to hearing it, this is the first step in improving performance. One last slide that I will share. Oh, and avoiding the why question. Very often as human beings, we want to understand something, we want to know why. In my experience, I stay away from the why question because it always comes across as accusing or shaming. Even if you're genuinely interested and curious and want to know why, when you ask the why question, I would be very cautious because it can be perceived as, why did you do that versus why did you do that? Very easy to confuse that just by where you put the emphasis. So avoiding the why question is probably a good, or being very intentional if you do ask it. And then focusing on the future. Giving feedback is not about, it's about holding someone accountable, but it's much more about how do we improve going forward. Keeping your critique future-oriented is really important because that's what really matters. That's what you want to come out of the discussion. And the final slide around corrective actions. When you have an employee where there's been a problem, let me start off by saying that problems never begin with a capital P, or mostly they don't. They typically begin with a small p, and they become a big P when you don't pay attention to them. So you want to nip problems early on. You want to be able to articulate what the problem is. Naming the problem, being able to name it and articulate it is really important if you're going to correct it. Articulate what you expect. What is it that you want this employee to do around that problem? Be specific and concrete. Focus on behaviors versus attitude. It's very hard to evaluate attitude. That's why in any kind of corrective action and any kind of providing feedback to people, always look to the behaviors. What can I observe? What did I observe? Putting it in writing is very important for legal and technical reasons. Plus, it's a way to clarify what we understand. If it's a correction action plan, it's going to lay out specific objectives that have to be addressed, and within a certain time frame. They have to be concrete and measurable. And having it in writing is just simply a way of saying, okay, this is the blueprint that we will follow. And lastly, follow your HR policies. It's really important that if you have HR policies that tell you to do X, Y, and Z, you better be doing X, Y, and Z. It's a good practice to review your HR policies every several years. Make sure they're current and up to date. It's a good practice in the boardroom to make sure that you discuss HR policies at a high level. The question for the board members, do our HR policies reflect our real values about our employees? That's a really good question to grapple with in the boardroom from time to time. So following your HR policies are very important in all of this. So we come to a wrap-up kind of end of this. I want to just share with you that there are some related webinars to the one we are just concluding around screening and hiring staff in general. And these webinars are all posted. They're all archived on the NCULI website and available to any of you all and any of your colleagues, your board members, or fellow staff people. Conducting performance interviews and dealing with challenging employees. These are more in-depth and related kind of webinars that you might find of interest to supplement the webinar that we're just concluding right now. This, again, is contact information about me. Let me just point out that you can reach me anytime at that email address. Know that I respond to every email I get. If you don't hear from me within 24 hours, I didn't get it. But I would welcome any comments or questions or any way I could be helpful to you all. Please feel free to reach out. If you don't know me already, that's my email address. And then I wanted to just kind of leave some time for questions, and I can't find that slide somewhere, but it may not be here. So I'm going to just open it up. If you do have any questions, Ryan, are there any questions in the chat room?
There are no questions yet. I did type in your two questions. What does outstanding customer service look like? And two, how are your patients not like customers?
Mm-hmm. Well, as we're coming to the end here, I guess I would share a thought with you about that second question. And that is, how are clients or patients not like customers? When I think about a customer, I think about a person who walks into a store and they know what they want, or they're shopping around, they have some idea. When I think about patients coming into a clinic, you have a range of people who come in around something that's personal and very private. Sometimes it's distressing. or anxiety-provoking. Some people, it takes some courage just to walk in the door or to make that phone call, to make an appointment. And so when I think about how customers are not like patients, patients come in a very personal way, in a very fragile way sometimes, or a very vulnerable way. And it's vitally important that when they walk in the door or when the person answers the phone, that what they're going to hear is someone who is open and welcoming and not judgmental and is willing to listen and try to understand what the client needs so they can be helpful. And that kind of overall quality is what you absolutely want in anyone who works in your center who's in contact with patients. And it is something, as I said earlier, that's the part of the iceberg that's under the water, and you have to get to it. And it's those kind of qualities that you can't teach somebody once they're on the job. Either they bring those qualities to the work or they don't. So I wish you all well in your hirings and in your supervising. I hope that the webinar has provided some specific kind of ideas, stimulated some thinking, and leaves you a little bit more knowledgeable than when we first began. Again, I want to thank Ryan and the NCUI staff, and I want to turn it back over to Ryan now. And one more thing is to remind you about the evaluation. Please do go to that link and provide us with your feedback. We want to hear it all. Please be honest and direct. We're willing to listen. Ryan, it's up to you.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks for providing us all this great information today. Again, to our participants, if you have any questions for Tony, now would be the time to ask them. That question and answer pod is at the lower right of your screen. The presentation slides are available for download. There's a download pod there at the bottom of your screen. And the webinar has been recorded, and it's going to be archived on the NCUI website shortly. And if we're waiting for anybody to type questions, we also invite you to participate in that survey link that is in the participant chat. And if you've registered for this webinar, you'll be receiving that survey for the evaluation. And then lastly, you can mark your calendar for our next Eastern. And this webinar is going to be the first part of two series on marketing and outreach in Native American communities. And this first webinar on the 30th is going to focus on the urban Indian community. And registration information can be found on our website, ncui.org.